Welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us a little bit early. Professor Morris is going to be on at 7 to start his program, but I'm glad you're able to join us just so that Susie and I can introduce Open Lands and the History Center respectively. So for those of you who don't know me, my name is Alexandra Schneider, and I am the manager of public programs and visitor services at the History Center. Just to give you a little overview of who we are and what we do, we are a community museum focused on the history of Lake Forest and Lake Bluff. We have a large research collection with a lot of archival material dating back largely to the 1840s. We have a large education center with a lot of digital resources. And if you haven't come out to check us out, I sincerely hope that you do very soon. We're located at 509 East Deer Path on the corner of Washington and Deer Path, just across the street from Triangle Park and the Lake Forest Library in the old Church of Christ Scientist. So we're pretty easy to find. The big steeple is kind of a giveaway. But we're open Tuesday through Thursday, 10 to 4, and on Saturdays, 1 to 4. And keeping in the theme of tonight's presentation, we have a really exciting exhibit up right now, in addition to our permanent exhibit on maps, specifically maps of Lake County. It's a really impressive collection. It's a lot of fun to come in, maybe find where you grew up or where you lived and see how the land has developed, everything from maps of the entire Great Lakes region from the late 1700s, I believe, to the original plotting map of Lake Forest that was done by Almer and Hotchkiss in the 1850s, to maps in the 1970s, where you can see a lot of what we have today, up on the wall. But it's a really interesting display, and you can trace, different different street patterns, different plots of land and who was owning them, and you see a lot of really familiar names. So I hope you all will be able to come in and join us to check that out very soon. That's going to be up through October. We do a lot of programs, a few on Zoom like this, but we're starting to hopefully transfer into live in-person programs again. We'll see how everything goes, but we're glad to have this flexibility. We do a lot of tours during the summer as well, and we have a bike tour of Lake Forest coming up on September 5th, which should be a lot of fun. That's sort of a back by popular demand, and it's going to take you through a lot of the start, I think, at the Lake Forest Cemetery, go through like the Lake Forest Cemetery and a lot of the neighborhoods. So that'll be really interesting. We have another map program. We're going to look at the art of map making with local artist Mark McMahon, and that's on September 16th. And that, as of right now, is scheduled to be an in-person program. And then Professor Carl Smith is going to be giving a presentation on September 30th via Zoom on the Great Chicago Fire to sort of commemorate the upcoming sesquicentennial in October. And then we have a lot of different programs coming up, more on maps. We're going to have a new travel exhibit that's going to be debuting in November with accompanying programs, and then a lot of walking tours. So I will put our programs link in the chat box for you all to check out. And of course, what would an organization introduction be without a very brief plug for membership? We're always excited to hopefully get some new members. We offer discounts on programs. You find out about different programs first. And, and if you're interested in volunteering, we're also happy to train docents and have people come in and be part of the organization. We love collaborating with our fellow nonprofits in the area. And so with that, I just wanted to, invite you all to come in and visit. Feel free to email me with any questions. I'll put my email in the chat box as well. But with that, I want to say thank you again to Susie for helping, partner on this with this program, and turn it over to her to talk a little bit about open lands as well.
Great. It's hard to follow, Alex. I mean, words just flow off her tongue like hybridity and sesquicentennial, and what the History Center is doing is so impressive, and we're so fortunate to be partnering with Alex and her colleagues tonight at the History Center on a Great Lakes topic, which is near and dear to Lake Forest Open Lands heart. So I'm Susie Hoffman, and I'm the Director of Outreach and Engagement at Lake Forest Open Lands, which is our own land trust here in our own community. We manage and care for about 800 acres in our town in 7 different preserves. All of these have important history, which is why it's a great fit for us to partner with the History Center, because some of the history of Lake Forest really derives from some of these beautiful estates that have become our preserves. But our goal as a land trust is to bring these back to pre-settlement times. Before a lot of you came on, Alex and I and Mike were chatting about the importance of native plants. So we try to eradicate invasive plants in our preserves and encourage everyone in our community to do the same, so that we have a wonderful environment for the birds and the animals that live here, and for people too. So we have 12 miles of walking trails through our preserves. They're beautiful at every time of year. I would encourage you all, if you haven't been, to try and get out in those preserves. We have a staff of field educators that are often out in the preserves and are really happy to talk with you at any time about the land that you're seeing, the history, the ecological history, as well as the cultural history. So we've had, so that's our general push. That's what we do. We also have a pretty robust education program for everybody from preschool littles to adults. This partnership right this evening is part of our monthly conservation cocktails series, where we talk about a different area of conservation that would be interesting to people in our community. And as we were talking before, sometimes it's in person at Lake Forest Open Lands, out at our headquarters at the corner of Deer Path and Waukegan. And obviously for the last 1.5 years, it's largely been on Zoom. And we try to focus on a topic, as I said, that would interest our community, but also we get a speaker like Professor Morris tonight, or we've had people speak on owls, on mushrooms, on native orchids and coastal zones and shorebirds. There's just been a myriad of things that we talk about with experts, and then we get a chance to interact with them, much as we're going to do tonight. So our conservation cocktails evenings are really a lot of fun, and we've been doing them for 3 years and hope to get back in person shortly. We've also been partnering with the Native American community in our area, in the Chicago area this year, and are developing a lot of programming around that topic, because we know that our land and our work with the land goes back over 52 years, but the land was cared for by people long before that. So we're finally making that very important cultural connection. And so look for some programs in that, in that area coming up. To that end, our next conservation cocktails, which is on September 10 and will be in person at Lake Forest Open Lands, focuses on Native American perspective on plants and what they meant to the Native American community. So I would encourage you to join us, come out to Open Lands and have a glass of wine. And we have a Native American plant expert on the edible and medicinal prairie coming to speak with us. And then we'll take a little walk through the beautiful prairie. So we encourage you to do that. We also have our annual Bagpipes and Bonfire event, which I think many of you know about, coming up again in person. We weren't in person last year because of the pandemic, but we are back on the field at Middle Fork on September 19th, which is a Sunday evening. It is a fundraiser, so there is tickets for that, but the pipers play, the Native American dancers dance, and it's a wonderful community event. I would love to see you all out there if you're interested. The night before that is sort of a little bit of a holdover from our reimagined bagpipes during COVID. We're having pipers in various locations all over town at sunset on Saturday night as a preview, basically, of the Sunday night event, playing Amazing Grace. So you can walk out your door if you live in Lake Forest and probably hear that wafting through the air. So that's our big excitement in September. We're not quite as organized as Alex outlined the History Center as being regarding our events for the fall, but there will be some, so watch our website for that. And That's it.
Great. Thank you, Susie. Those sound
Thank you,
like
Alex.
so much fun. I'm gonna have to sign up for several of those.
Please.
Well, with that, I see that Professor Morris is in the audience now, so I'm going to turn to the second portion of our program this evening and give the more formal introduction. So again, thank you all so much for joining us. Thank you to Open Lands and Susie for helping co-present this presentation. Thank you to Maddie Dugan, who has helped to make our Zoom presentations possible as we continue dealing with variants and whatnot and kind of see where the world goes. For those of you who haven't already done so, if I could ask you to go ahead and mute your microphones. We have a really nice big group signed on tonight, so this should help with cutting down any ambient noise. For those of you who are unfamiliar with Zoom, which I think is a very, very tiny portion of the population at this point, but if any of you are, you'll see in the top right portion of your screen the opportunity to change your view. I suggest that you select speaker view, and you'll be able to see the person who is speaking at a larger scale. Finally, Professor Morris is very happy to take questions for this program, but what I'm going to have you do is you'll see at the very bottom of your screen a little chat icon. And if you have a question throughout the program or when we get to the end of the program for the Q&A section, if you could address your questions to me, Alexandra Schneider, I will go ahead and moderate those at the end of the program. So with that, thank you again so much all for joining us, and I'm going to turn it over to our speaker this evening, Professor Christopher Morris.
Thank you. It's terrific to be here. This is a real pleasure for me. I grew up on the Great Lakes, not Michigan, but parts of Huron and Erie and Ontario, and my mother grew up on the shores of Lake Superior. So between the two of us, we've got 4 of the 5 lakes covered. I've got cousins in Chicago, so I guess that counts too. So this is a subject, mapping the Great Lakes, that has interested me for some time. My own research before I started working on the lakes was on the Mississippi River Valley. And it's through that research that I encountered a number of 17th and 18th century French map makers, which led me to English and American map makers as well. And many of the cartographers of the Mississippi Valley were also cartographers of the Great Lakes, going from the cartographers who worked with Marquette himself, but also right up to the Army Corps of Engineers and then much more recently the National Oceanographic and Aeronautical Atmospheric Administration. So all of these map makers were working in the central part of North America, the Mississippi Valley, and that led me to into the Great Lakes and sort of back to home. So I'm very honored to be here this evening. I'm going to put my images, because you can't talk about maps without actually looking at them, on the screen, and hope that they all come up. So let's see. Is that working, Alex? Can you see the whole thing? Okay. All righty. So my title, Mapping the Great Lakes from Discovery to Scientific Surveying, essentially takes me from maps like this. This was Champlain's map from 1615, from about the time that he first saw one of the Great Lakes. Right here, this is Georgian Bay, which is part of Lake Huron, and this is the part that he he encountered. In fact, right now, I am around in here talking to you. And this is the North Channel leading to Lake Superior. This is Lake Ontario, and here's Lake Erie. Not much of a lake on his map, and I'll explain that later. But from maps like this to maps like this, maps from our own time. This is a 2016 image from the NOAA Coast Survey. So if any of you do any boating on the lakes, you will be familiar with their charts. And there's a counterpart in Canada too, and they're always sharing information. But before I get into this history of European and European American map making, I want to say a few things about indigenous maps. And I'm going to start with this map drawn by Champlain, Samuel de Champlain, in 1603, and it's based largely on information he gathered from indigenous map makers, really. In 1603, somewhere near where Montreal is now, Champlain had several Algonquin First Nations or indigenous people draw him a map of the upper region of the St. Lawrence River. The map included the lakes that we know as Ontario and Erie, but the Algonquins admitted that they had little familiarity with Lake Erie. They offered instead their understanding of the upper lakes based on what they had been told by others, for the most part. And they may well have confused Superior with Hudson Bay, or it may have been something of an error in the translation from Algonquin to French. It may have been also just confusion in Champlain's own mind. But in any case, the Algonquins mentioned the lake of salt water, salty like the sea, Champlain reported. And obviously there's no salty Great Lake. So something happened here to indicate that some sort of confusion. But it also perhaps reflected Champlain's aspiration to find a water route across North America. We all know that Columbus, when he sailed west across the Atlantic, was trying to get to China. And when he failed, the idea of going west to get to the east continued. The French explorations in North America were very much a part of that, trying to find a water route right through North America. Actually, it's a subject that interests me unendingly, because that's what Lewis and Clark were trying to do. That's what the Transcontinental Railroad was about, primarily getting to the West Coast and using San Francisco as a port to get to China. So the French map makers and explorers, including Champlain, were very much a part of this long history of trying to find a water route across the north. Now, Champlain's map, the indigenous map that these Algonquin cartographers drew for him, is long gone. We don't know what happened to it. We're not even sure exactly how it was drawn, but the record clearly indicates cartographic skill, indigenous cartographic skill, and geographic knowledge. The geographic knowledge contained in this map informed Champlain's map that I'm showing you here. So Champlain had not seen any of these lakes yet. He was down around here. This would be the Ottawa River, and this is Lake Ontario here, I guess, and the upper lakes up in here. So this was based entirely on what he learned from his Algonquin partners, really. Here's a couple of other examples of indigenous maps. This one is not nearly so old as Champlain's map. This actually is from the 19th century, but it was an image that I was able to get through the website for the National Archives in the UK. It's a map drawn on birch bark, and this is a copy of it because you can't really see the lines very easily here. You might be able to see this line here on the birch bark, which is reproduced down here. And what we have here is an Ojibwe or Anishinaabe birch bark map that was found in 1841. It was attached to a tree in the portage area between the Ottawa River and Georgian Bay on Lake Huron, which I'll have more to say about this, but it was an important part of the Algonquin and Huron canoe route to the west, and then it became very important for the French as well. What Indigenous people lacked was not geographical knowledge and spatial knowledge. What they lacked was pen and paper. But they probably drew maps. Well, they obviously drew on birch bark at certain points. They probably drew maps on dirt with sticks in the ground. We know that they painted and they etched on leather and on stone. So they had their own cartographic tradition. Maps are abstract representations of real spaces intended to convey information. And maps do that in many different ways. The most common way that maps convey information is by leaving out a lot of information, information that is deemed extraneous, unnecessary, irrelevant. And this is how then the useful information is highlighted. So if you think of the NOAA coast surveys like this, you will see no indications of rocky shorelines or sandy beaches or trees or forests along the lake. We know what the shoreline of Lake Michigan looks like, but not from the map. You wouldn't know that from the map. That's deemed irrelevant information by the map maker. It would just clutter the map and get in the way. So information may be found in other sources or even in other maps. So a US geological survey map or topographical map of the sort that's favored by hikers and campers and so forth contains different information than the Great Lakes survey maps produced by NOAA. All right, so here we have an indigenous map of the Boundary Waters region between Minnesota and Ontario on the western end of Lake Superior. This is very typical of indigenous maps because it's not an attempt to be correct the way we would define correct. It's intended to convey information useful to indigenous travelers. So the lakes, Lake Superior is over here somewhere, over here, and then there are a number of lakes until you get to Lake Winnipeg. And if you were traveling, you would just have to know that I'm in 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 lakes, and I still have a bunch of lakes to go. That was much more important information than whether the shapes of the lake are correct. So this is a very typical way of drawing maps. In this case, it's the style of the Cree, drawn in 1729 for the French explorer Le Vérandille. So fittingly, Lake of the Woods, actually the Lake Winnipeg's out here somewhere. This is Lake of the Woods showing all the islands in the lake. A spectacularly beautiful lake, by the way, that is, in this case, is intended to convey the information you know you've gotten to the right lake here when you see all these islands. The actual dimensions, as I said, of these lakes and the shapes of each river and lake on them are not considered useful information. I'll come back to this one in a moment. This one here is an Iroquois map of the eastern Great Lakes. It's a little bit hard to figure out, maybe, but you start looking somewhat carefully, turn it sideways, because the notes done by the European who accepted the map and then made his own notations on it, they go from, let's see, what would that's north. So they go from west to east. So you have to reorient the map the way we would, with north at the top. And what you can see is Lake Ontario here, Lake Huron here, or Lake Erie, excuse me, here. This is Niagara Falls. This is the St. Lawrence River region here, and the Ottawa River. This would be Lake Nipissing. This is Lake Champlain here. So New York, Albany, New York is down around in here somewhere. But this is a map drawn by the Iroquois for a man named Robert Livingston, who was an Albany, New York fur trader. The map covers much area around New York and Ontario, parts of Pennsylvania, down in here, the rivers down here flow into Pennsylvania. The Susquehanna is down here. But again, it's not accurate the way we measure an accurate map, but it contained the information that was useful to indigenous fur traders. And for that matter, information that was useful to fur traders like Livingston. There's some other interesting things about this particular map. There are no portages indicated. So this area here, for example, there's not one continuous stream from Lake Huron into the St. Lawrence River. There are a group of, or series of portages in here. This river flows this way. This river flows this way. But they're not indicated here. And this tells us that portages were not considered obstacles, at least for the Iroquois. They were considered a consistent water route. So hoisting a canoe upon your shoulders meant that you had no obstruction. If you could carry your canoe from one body of water to another, it was as though those two bodies of water were connected by water. Down here, we don't see these rivers in New York, the Mohawk River Valley connected to the Susquehanna River Valley. They're clearly divided. And this would indicate an area that is, the distance is too great to simply portage a canoe. So these river systems are not connected, according to the Iroquois, but these river systems are connected. Even if a hydrologist, present-day hydrologist, would say, no, they are very much disconnected because this river flows this way and this one flows this way. So different sources of information here conveyed on these maps. For Europeans, waterfalls were a major obstacle, not really overcome until the 19th century with the Erie Canal and the Welland Canal. So we got Niagara Falls marked with a little X here, but it's not a very important mark at all, because for Native peoples to put the canoe on your back and walk up the Niagara escarpment to the upper part of the river meant that this was all connected. But that's not the way Europeans saw it at all. Champlain first saw Lake Huron, and when he did see Lake Huron, he produced this map here. He first saw Lake Huron in July of 1615. He and a party of French and Algonquins guided 2 canoes through the Ottawa River, through the portage into Georgian Bay, along the French River here, and began to descend Georgian Bay to the Huron territory around here at the southern end of Georgian Bay. It took them several days to make that journey, and Champlain himself was quite blown away by the lake when he saw it. As I mentioned, he'd heard about it for over a decade, but he was quite blown away. He named it Mer la Douce, meaning freshwater sea, which is a kind of a pretty name as well as an appropriate name. This was the eastern portion of Lake Huron, and as he put it, we went some 45 leagues all the time along the shore of the lake, around all these islands here, which those islands would have sheltered the canoes from prevailing westerlies and from waves of the sort that would frustrate anyone, even the most experienced paddlers in a canoe. On August 1st, Champlain and his party arrived at the Huron villages at the southern end of the lake. And then at the behest of his Huron hosts, Champlain joined a war party that took him across Lake Simcoe, which is here on his map, and then down a series of rivers into the eastern end of Lake Ontario. And from there, he went into the Cayuga River region in here, in present-day New York. For several weeks, Huron and French warriors laid siege to an Oneida village before returning to the shore of Lake Ontario. It was late in the fall, and Champlain was unable to return to Quebec, so he spent the winter in Huronia. And then in April 1616, at the end of April, he set out for Quebec, and from there he went to France, where he produced this map. This is the first European map of the Great Lakes, produced by somebody who had actually seen the Great Lakes. Champlain, that is, kept revising his maps over the next decade and a half based on information that he gathered personally and information that he collected from various explorers, coureurs de bois, as they were called, as well as Jesuits. And the Jesuits were increasingly, over these years, important sources of information for French explorers such as Champlain, because the Jesuits, many of them were trained cartographers, quite skilled at collecting cartographic information. Champlain probably learned about most of these, like he had seen this area, but the western end western side of Lake Huron and Lake Superior or Grand Lac, as he called it, he would have learned most likely from Etienne Brulé, who was a 16-year-old boy who he instructed to go live with the native peoples and learn their languages and to learn about the geography of the area. I'm going to come back to this point later, but here is Lake Erie. So here's Ontario. Niagara Falls is in here, and we've got Lake Erie and probably Lake St. Clair here, and the St. Clair River and the Detroit River here. Lake Erie was not a significant lake, so it did not figure prominently on the maps, nor in the information that Champlain acquired, because the primary canoe routes were up the Ottawa River this way, or he may even intend this to be the Ottawa River and down. And then there were backcountry routes, water routes up this way. So they didn't go over Niagara Falls and through Lake Erie. You'll also notice that Lake Michigan isn't here, although maybe this is Lake Michigan in here. They didn't really know, the French didn't really know about it, again, because at this point, it was not a significant lake, because the fur traders and the explorers were moving west, they were not moving south yet. In 1603, Champlain, that's when Champlain first learned of of Lake Ontario, which he was told was, or estimated was, about 300 leagues long. By 1632, so almost 30 years later, he'd learned about Lake St. Clair, but hadn't really seen it. And he learned a little bit more about Erie, but again, hadn't seen it and wasn't really interested in it. Moving along, though, things began to change a little bit. But here, before I move, I just want to show you that this was his earlier map, and this is his later map. So there's about 20 or 30 years difference, and you can see he's revised somewhat, but they're also somewhat similar too. So here's Lake Ontario and the open areas in Lake Superior between rapids, or not Lake Superior, what am I talking about? In the St. Lawrence River with rapids in here, and they're over here on his later map as well. He's reoriented Ontario somewhat. He hasn't really changed Lake Erie much between the maps, but he's changed the Lake Superior area somewhat. It's much more clearly defined as a lake on his later map than it is earlier. This map, I was talking to Alex about it earlier today. This map was made in 1641, and it is the first map drawn by a European to indicate all 5 of the Great Lakes. So here we have Ontario and Erie and Huron and Superior and Michigan right in here. What's significant about this map is again, the east-west orientation of the lakes and the water routes. And what's also important about it is the delineation of French territory and Mexico, Virginia, the New Netherlands in here, and New England. There's Cape Cod. Not done very accurately, according to maybe 21st century standards, according to 19th century standards for that matter. And yet, the information that is useful to the French is all contained on this map. And that useful information has to do with the number of lakes and their east to west orientation. What's important about this is Virginia, the English down here and the Dutch and the Spanish are shut out of the lakes. The French surround, according to this map, the water route that leads far to the west. And in fact, in this close-up of that map, what we see in here is a notation that says it's believed that this lake here, Lake Superior, discharges itself towards China, indicating that the French think they have found this water route across the continent. This is the sort of information that this map maker wants to convey. The actual shapes of the lakes are not so important, whether they're accurate or not. The fact that the important information is this water route to the west becomes even more clear when we consider that the rival maps produced by rivals to the French, produced by the English and by the Dutch, did not contain all the lakes for many years, decades, in fact, because the French rivals did not believe that the French had really found this water route to the west. So they refused to believe. They thought it was a red herring. When they saw French maps, they thought the French were leading them on, trying to trick them, feeding them false information. Because remember, the English had not seen these maps yet. So what they know about the Great Lakes at this time, they know from French sources. So they were very skeptical of the French sources. So here we have, for example, a 1652 map drawn by a Dutch map maker. And this is 10 years after the French map showing all 5 lakes. And this map just has 1 lake. Because the Dutch, for a long time, refused to believe that the French had found all of these lakes. All right, so let's see. Well, here's another map by Nicholas Sanson in 1650. The top left corner is left open because it was as yet unknown to Europeans. But this one, Lake Superior, it doesn't show the west end of Lake Superior. It may possibly be on the Pacific. It's not saying it is, and it's not saying it isn't, but it's leaving that open to, leaving that possibility open. All right, so I'll return to this map just for a moment. What this map does is it collects, collates, and renders visible a landscape and a waterscape, and also a political ethnography and geography of indigenous peoples. And that's what all these notations are here. These are all different indigenous villages or territories, and the hilly areas, as well as the rivers and the lakes. All of that was important information for the French. The imperial and commercial ambitions of the French are suggested by the geographical specifics, such as the hills and the rivers and the lakes. But the prominence given to the frequently warring nations of the Algonquins to the north and the Iroquois to the south. So here we have the Algonquins and the Iroquois. That was important information. Other information is marginalized. So New Mexico, Virginia, and these areas, they're on the peripheries. All the action is up here, this map says. This map presents on paper the French claim to this part of North America, which therefore makes it real. It must exist because I've seen the map. There it is on the map, that water route to the west. So the North America that Champlain and other early French explorers described and wanted to believe was real, in a sense, became real when they put it on a map. The shapes of the lakes may be wrong, but there are 5 of them, and France claims them all. And that's the information that this map maker sought to convey. I should say, I saw this map in the archives in London, and I had to go to this special room called the Invigilation Room, where they brought it into me, and there were cameras in the room to make sure that I didn't touch the map too much, that I didn't somehow smuggle it into my, I don't know, my backpack or something, because it's quite a valuable map with an interesting history. As far as scholars know from information that they have pieced together, this map was made in about 1641, and it remained in Canada, in Quebec, probably until the fall of Quebec. During the 7 Years' War, it then found itself into British hands and made its way at some point to England, where it was lost until it was rediscovered in an archive, an official government library in the 1960s, I think, and it was subsequently authenticated. So this is an old map, but it's beautiful. I can't get I did my best to bring the colors out, but when you see it, in person, it's really quite spectacular. This, all right, is a map of Lake Superior from 1671. It's attributed to Claude Allouet Claude Allouet Dablon, who traveled with Jacques Marquette, who also probably helped with this map. Many Jesuits, as I mentioned, were trained cartographers. So these particular cartographers drew this rather spectacular, and we would say today, incredibly accurate map of Lake Superior. This map appears accurate because the replication of the shape is what is important here to this map maker. This is the information that's being conveyed. What I'm getting at is, how is it that we go from this map in 1641 to this map in 1671, 30 years, and we go from this incredibly inaccurate map, we would say, in terms of looking at the shape of the lakes, to this one, which would rival a satellite image of Lake Superior. If they could draw maps like this, why did they bother drawing maps like this? And it gets to my point about the information that is being conveyed. Too much information causes clutter. It gets in the way. But for the Jesuits, the shape of the lake was really important because they traveled all around this lake, not only to map it, but to find out where people lived, because they wanted to convert people that they found to their religion. The map appears accurate to us. Exactly how accurate is difficult to say. We know that the map makers greatly exaggerated the size of Lake Superior, probably doubling the lake here. By their own reckoning, it was, translating leagues into miles, about 720 miles long, they thought, which is about double the length that for Lake Superior, in fact. But that in and of itself is not necessary information. All you need to know about Lake Superior is that it's huge. And whether it's 300 miles long or 700 miles long doesn't really matter. We do know that the Jesuits were looking for people and settlements and places to establish missions all around, so they were really interested in the shoreline. They weren't out there principally looking for trade routes to the west. We also know something about see, what we know about the nations of France and England and Spain and the Netherlands is that they all sought dominion over vast territories in North America. And that made maps like this ultimately more valuable than this. So this is a map of value to the Jesuits, but not really of value to the French government or the British government or the government in Amsterdam, because or the New Netherlands, because it's too detailed. It's not going to get them anywhere. But it was useful for the Jesuits. And the information collected by Allouez, Marquette, Louis Joliet, and others went into this map produced in 1675. So again, that very accurate representation of Lake Superior is on this map here. Suddenly we have a big Lake Erie. Why exactly, I'm not sure, but just except to say that the Jesuits used or were interested in different information in their maps than the fur traders and explorers were. Okay, so here we have a bunch of different maps produced over the 18th century. And the question is, how can they be so inaccurate in the 18th century when fairly accurate maps were drawn in the 17th century? Right, so this one from 1675, but here we go almost 100 years later. Look at Lake Superior here. Look at Lake Superior here in 1733. You would almost think it's like they didn't even bother looking at any of the earlier maps. Maybe they did, maybe they didn't. But again, what counted as accurate information for these otherwise skilled map makers was different than we might calculate, right? The answer depends why they made maps like this. Depends on how you gauge accuracy, and that depends on the information presented in the map. The map on the bottom right here from 1755 reflects the struggle for domination in North America between Britain and France during the 7 Years' War. The earlier maps that depicted Lake Superior so expertly were not relevant. So for this map in 1755, this is where the action is. It's much more important to get New England and Pennsylvania and New York right than it is to get Lake Superior right because of the conflict. We can see some of the Allegheny Mountains here in close-ups here. We can, if I zoomed in, I could show you the forts here, Fort Niagara, and other places that would become important during the 7 Years' War. So it's the border region between Canada and New England that becomes important here, and the lakes from Detroit and rivers from Detroit to Montreal and to New York City that become really important. Here's a close-up, or not a close-up. This is the full image of Jeffrey's map. He's got the water routes to the west. This is kind of interesting, though. If you remember that earlier map, the Indigenous map, with the lakes, all the lakes drawn more or less as circles and lined up. Sort of what we're getting here on this map. So the accurate map for Jeffreys shows this territory here because that's the area at issue between the English and the French in the 1750s. And the farther away from that scene of central action here, his map almost dissolves into an indigenous map out here. And that's probably where a lot of his information came from too, indigenous sources. This is, again, the map from 1641. It has no information of any use really south of Iroquois territory in the New York and northern Pennsylvania region. But this map has important information along the eastern seaboard and draws it fairly accurately, we would say. So beginning with Columbus in 1492 and lasting through Lewis and Clark and later, really until Amundsen successfully crossed the Northwest Passage in 1903, Europeans dreamed of getting to China by sailing west. And the maps, the early maps, French maps, support that idea, and they are oriented, and the details and the information, what they considered accurate information, goes from east to west. By the middle of the 18th century, the rivalry between France and Great Britain had shifted the focus of the map makers to a north-south axis near the eastern seaboard. So this area here. And the 7 Years' War maps show two great empires separated primarily by Lake Ontario. So Lake Ontario and then to a certain extent Lake Erie become really prominent in these maps from the seven Years' War era in a way that they were not so prominent before, Erie in particular. This map here is from the 7 Years' War. I think it's this one. Let me see. Oh, this map here is from the 7 Years' War period. The notation down here, which is hard to read, it says, in our present course of proceeding in America as conceived, it is impossible to bring the war to a happy close or to gain the Indians over to our interest unless we break the communication of the French settlements, which may be done by building a strong fort at the mouth of the River Conde, a second on the south side of Lake Huron, and a third at the French River. But it will be proper to begin with building a fort at River Conde and to have several rowboats and forts. The point is that there's a whole lot of information about this area here and where forts should go. And so these lakes here become much more important than they were earlier. They also mentioned galleys on the lake, rowing galleys and sailing vessels on the lakes at this time. So what happens in the 7 Years' War through the War of the American Revolution and up through the War of 1812 is this reorientation of the cartography of the lakes from east to west to north south. And then as vessels larger than canoes became increasingly common on the lake, on the lakes, then the maps begin to change. The War of 1812, much like the 7 Years' War, focused on Lake Ontario and the St. Lawrence River region. Following the Treaty of Ghent in 1814, once again, two rivals now, British Canada and the United States, looked suspiciously at each other across the Great Lakes. So what we get from images at this time, such as this one and this one in particular, are maps that show in great detail Lake Erie and Lake Ontario, the Niagara River region, including settlements along the land, because there had been a war and there's fear that there will be more wars breaking out in this area. So again, before up here was really important, this whole area was what was important. Now It's this area here by the War of 1812. In 1815, so 200 years after Champlain first saw the Great Lakes, during the coldest decade of the millennium, and this is for a number of reasons, in 1815 having to do with important volcanic eruptions on the other side of the world. 1815 and 16 were incredibly cold years. At that time, William Owen began his surveys of Lake Huron, Lake Erie, and Lake Ontario for the British Admiralty. And here we have Owen's map of Lake Ontario published in 1817. All of a sudden, we've got what we would recognize as a scientific survey in 1817. So again, a brief period of time. You can go back to the 50 years earlier, and Lake Superior looks odd. It's not even recognizable as a lake. It's not as accurate as the maps from the 1600s. And then early in the 19th century, we get maps that are incredibly accurate, complete with the soundings. And this has everything to do with the size of the vessels now that are on the lakes. So it looks like a modern chart. And the Admiralty surveys initiated by Owens were continued by other cartographers working for the British Admiralty, as well as eventually the Corps of Engineers beginning in the 1840s and since the 1970s by the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration. They're also the basis for the maps produced by the Canadian Hydrographic Service. So after the battles on the lakes, the Admiralty surveys were deemed essential to defend the British colonies of Upper Canada and Lower Canada, as well as to promote trade in the region. The end of the war also coincided with the beginning of shipping on the lakes, first with sail, but very soon after with steam. Large vessels engaged in commerce both exacerbated US-British rivalry over the lakes, but also kind of soothed it because both sides needed information on all of the lakes, and both sides wanted to trade back and forth across the lake. So, for example, we know in the 19th century, later in the 19th century, that Chicago was built with timber taken from forests, not only in Michigan and Wisconsin, but in Ontario as well. So, so shipping natural resources across the border became really important and viable with steam vessels. Again, Great Lakes fishing became important on both sides. So in that way, the maps were shared information and kind of soothed the tensions between the two rivals at the same time as providing useful information for defense purposes should a war break out. After the Admiralty recalled Owen to England in 1816, the task of completing the survey fell to his assistant, Henry Bayfield, and with two cutters, a single-mast sailing vessel is a cutter, designed for speed and maneuverability in shallow waters, he and his crew set out and sailed around most of the other lakes, at least on the British side, so not Michigan, and drew charts. And what's interesting, this is a later chart of Michigan, but what's interesting about his maps and the tools that he used, and he used compasses and theodolites and sextants and chronometers, and was measuring the locations and the angles of the shoreline to be kind of techno-scientific, and yet his efforts to make these maps ran up against the realities of the geography, and then his personality came out. So when you read some of the accounts that he wrote of making these maps, he talks about the swarms of mosquitoes that so irritated him, he would get angry, and at one point he dropped a valuable instrument on the rocks and it shattered. He also has in some of his survey, some of the notations, comments on the color of the water and the color of the sand, and he gets rather artistic in his comments. So the maps look to be rather scientific, but they're also very personal. They are based on scientific information, but gathered in these very personal moments when man confronts mosquito, for example. 18 working days, he said at one point. These days were long, surveying during the day and making calculations, drawing sketches, swatting mosquitoes after sunset. There has perhaps been no survey made of greater labor of detail than that of the 30,000 islands. Let's see if I have Georgian Bay. The 30,000 islands of Georgian Bay over here. Bayfield's charts painstakingly map inlets and rocks, mark water depths, portages, and offer brief descriptions of the landscape. So both scientific and very artistic and very personal. In the eastern Georgian Bay area, including this area here of the Bruce Peninsula, he offered very detailed notations on water depths in here. He did a lot of his surveying when the ice was on the river, and he could stand on the ice and drop a chain down to the bottom to measure. So he had all sorts of interesting methods here for making his map. And then his descriptions. One, for example, the mainland and the islands are low and barren. Secondary limestone contains a great number of fossil remains. They're fascinating maps. Yellow mud, blue mud, sand, hard bottom, soft bottom, clay, rocky, stony. On the one hand, these are important notations for any captain of a vessel who needs to know what the anchorage is like and what sort of anchor you're going to use and how you're going to set it. On the other hand, it's very artistic. He wants this real feel of the land here. All right, so just to wind down here, I wanted to just report briefly on some of the ways that I and three colleagues have used these maps to try to tell us something about the climate history of the Great Lakes, and has to do with the ways in which the maps are accurate and inaccurate and the way they change over time. So let me just begin by explaining or reminding those of you who are already very aware of this, how much the lakes change their levels. This is a chart going back several thousand years. Here's the present. So this is from the mid-19th century up to the present. Charts, or excuse me, a graph of water levels. These ones are estimates based on readings of shorelines, sandbars that are now up on dry land, and other sorts of information, tree ring cores, pollen counts, collected to measure the up and down cycles, the high and low cycles of the lakes themselves. What we know is that the lakes have several cycles embedded within cycles. So this is sort of illustrated up here. we have 30-year fluctuations within 160-year fluctuations within about 500-year fluctuations. The lakes are recharged. They're filled with water through precipitation. Most of the water in the lakes is actually glacial water left over from the last ice age. And as that water flows eventually to the ocean or it evaporates, it is refilled with snow, snow melt, and rain. This is the historical period, that is to say from 1860 to our own times, and we can see the highs and the lows. So I'm sitting on Georgian Bay right now, and when I was a kid here, I remember when the water was really low, and then it got really high. We lost our dock because the water level came in and came up too high, and it's gone down low again. Come back to that image, but this is a picture that was in a newspaper from a few years ago. It's on, I believe it's Georgian Bay. This is a little girl here sitting with her grandfather in 1994. Here's that girl all grown up, sitting on the same rock. So we can see how much the water has receded. This is pretty typical, these cycles. So we were using our maps to try to see if there were water cycles indicated in the maps, and those high and low cycles in the maps might, we hope, tell us something about dry spells and wet spells over the last several centuries of the lakes. What we looked at in particular, what caught our attention was the changing shape of Manitoulin Island here, which helps separate Georgian Bay from the larger part of Lake Huron. In the middle, towards the end of the 18th century, Manitoulin Island was frequently represented as a chain of islands, the Manitoulin Islands. Earlier maps had it as Manitoulin Island, sort of the shape of, I don't know, like a hammerhead shark here or something. Here's what it actually looks like in a satellite image. And we didn't notice this until we put over 300 maps scanned into a computer, and the computer data made this chain jump out at us, just because the computer algorithm measured the area of the lake. And when we had a chain of lakes, then the lake itself was bigger than it was here when Manitoulin is one solid lake. And it was a very precise computer algorithm, so it could measure the area, the surface area of the water here, and compare it to here. And what we saw over 300 maps averaged out by this computer algorithm was that there seemed to be more water in Lake Huron when Manitoulin was represented as a chain of islands. And we thought maybe the water is 4 or 5 feet higher in the lake at this point, which changes the shape of Manitoulin Island, perhaps giving it the appearance of a chain of islands. So if we look at this satellite image here, these inlets here might have been bigger because the lake is higher, suggesting to somebody who didn't know otherwise that this was a chain of islands. That's the sort of information we were looking for in our series of maps. And just to give you a sense of the maps as we collected them, here's a range of them from 1616 with Champlain up into the early 19th century. And we can see Manitoulin, 1801, a chain, 1804, a chain, 1814, a chain, 1796, a chain, But here, 1795, one island and going back, one island. We had textual accounts, that is to say, journals. And this fascinated me. There was one written about this time in 1814, and it's by a person who had been to Manitoulin Island earlier in the 18th century, and he's saying, all my life I thought Manitoulin Island was a single island. I've been to that island, and I even thought while I was standing on it that it was one island. But now in 1814, I've come to realize that it is a series of islands. Well, it isn't a series of islands, it's one island, but there was something going on that was fooling these map makers. So we crunched a lot of numbers with these maps and a lot of surface area. We managed to win a little bit of grant money to do all of this, to use humanistic historical evidence, these maps, in order to add a data point, we might say, to the historical climatology. And what we found in the end was that we couldn't really tell anything very accurately. The differences in the maps were so random, in a sense, and they were so tremendous between maps that we couldn't identify any clear patterns. So our hypothesis that that the lakes changed according to climate, the lakes on the maps changed according to what we know about the climate information, did not pan out. There was no correlation between Manitoulin as a single island, Manitoulin as a chain of islands, or any of the other information that we got from the maps, shoreline changes and so forth, that corresponded with any of this sort of information going back several hundred years. It was disappointing, but we learned an awful lot about the maps, the Great Lakes, and the relationship between science and art in the history of cartography. So I've talked long enough. I think at this point, I should just stop. Let's see, stop share. Whoop, there, that's what I want. And I don't know if, I can't remember, Alex, how much time you gave me. If I probably went over.
Just a little bit, but that's okay. That was so fascinating, and those visuals are just stunning. So thank you so much again for this presentation. And please, if anyone has any questions, feel free to put them in the chat. And while you're doing that, I wanted to apologize. I was so excited to get into the presentation. I neglected to give a little bit of information about your background. But I mean, you're an award-winning scholar. You were nominated for a Pulitzer and had, a fellowship at the Stanford Humanities Center. But, a lot of the work that you've done prior has to do with the American South. And I was curious kind of how you became interested in the human and water relationship in the American South, more specifically.
Oh, okay, I'm happy to answer that question. I was interested in the American South and some of the traditional topics, cotton and plantations and slavery and race relations in the era of the Civil War. But I found myself working on Mississippi and Louisiana, mostly because so much work had been done on other parts of the South. South Carolina and Virginia, for example, had attracted a lot of scholarly attention. I wanted to look at some places that had not been closely examined. So this was when I was in graduate school, more decades ago than I'd like to admit. But when I was doing that research, I got
Oh, we seem to have lost our speaker. Oh dear. Let's see if Chris pops back on, so that hopefully he can answer.
Can you hear me now?
Oh, there you are. Okay, great. Yes.
Okay. All right. So that got me really interested in the Mississippi River. And so I ended up writing a history of the Mississippi River from Hernando de Soto to Hurricane Katrina. And that's when I encountered all of these cartographers, many of them French Canadian, who were familiar with the Great Lakes, had drawn maps of the Great Lakes. And so, you know, then as I mentioned at the start of this talk, that took me back north. But I grew up on the Great Lakes, as I said, in the American South was just so different from Ontario, at least what I had learned about it and read about it, that for this Canadian kid, it had this kind of, you know, exoticism about it that appealed to me. But then I had this opportunity to kind of, you know, go back home, as it were, to go up the Mississippi River all the way to the Great Lakes.
Interesting. Thank you.
And I'm clearly, when I was still in school, I couldn't decide, you know, going to university, did I want to be a biology major or a history major? And my interest in the natural environment, the history of the natural environment, has allowed me to merge both those interests.
That's great.
Chris,
so
I have a question. Is it okay if I ask a question?
Sure, I have a couple questions in the chat too. So as soon as you're done, Susie, I'll go ahead and read those.
Okay. Chris, I always, as I also love the Great Lakes and love studying about them. And I always had heard that one of the reasons, in addition to the northern waterway routes from the Montreal, from the Seaway all the way over to Lake Superior, that one of the reasons they didn't go down to the, oh, there's my dog, I'm sorry, to Lake Erie is because it was surrounded by the Iroquois, certainly to the south, who were known as the Romans of the West. They were so warlike and fierce. Can you talk about that just a minute?
Sure. But the Iroquois themselves did not make much use of Lake Erie either at this time. So the easiest way to go west, to get to Lake Superior, was to go essentially north of present-day Toronto, the water routes from the north shore of Lake Ontario to the south shore of Georgian Bay, through the Lake Simcoe area. And the Iroquois were very active in that area, which is what pushed the Algonquins up the Ottawa River and down the French River. They kept moving farther north to avoid the Iroquois. I didn't mention in my talk, though, when French explorers, Marquette and then LaSalle connected, as it were, the Mississippi River to the Great Lakes region. What they were trying to do was to avoid the Iroquois. And if they could bring the furs from the west down the Mississippi to a base there, and eventually they built New Orleans, they wouldn't have to go east towards Montreal and risk losing losing their furs to Iroquois traders and hunters supplied by the British at Albany. And when they did that, then that made Lake Michigan far more important than it had been, and it starts appearing on the maps in important ways. But Lake Erie doesn't really become important until after the War of 1812, and principally with the plans to build the Erie Canal, and then Lake Erie becomes tremendously important.
We have a question about the north-south orientation of maps. When do we start to see that become the most commonplace depiction of the geography?
That becomes, I believe it's during the 7 Years' War, primarily. So it's the eastern lakes, and Lake Erie becomes important at that point, but mostly the eastern end, the Niagara area, and Ontario and the St. Lawrence, because those are boundaries between French Canada and British North America that are important for defense purposes, right? So both sides want to know the details of that area, and they want to know where the forts are and how you get from one fort to another. So what the river systems are at that point. And then that rivalry is continued, during the American Revolution, except it's between the British and the Patriots, and then the new United States, and then that's continued through the War of 1812. So the north-south orientation continues to grow during the conflicts of those years.
Continuing that whole theme of mapping being politically influenced, and yeah,
right.
Absolutely.
Right.
Another question, there was a map that showed Lake Michigan labeled as Lake Illinois. When did that lake take on the name Lake Michigan instead?
That's a good question. I don't know. The lakes very often were named for Indigenous people. So there are early maps that have Lake Ontario as Lake of the Iroquois, and there's Lake Huron. In early maps just had a Lake of the Hurons, and so that would be the Illinois as well. So when it became Michigan, I'm not sure. And for that matter, there were several names for Ontario when exactly Lake Ontario became, because it was also Lake St. Louis at one point. So when Ontario became the fixed name, I'm not sure.
Interesting. Okay, last question. So what kind of tools were available in the 17th century to these cartographers in the New World, and how did that technology sort of change through the 18th and 19th centuries?
Oh, okay. They didn't have, the early cartographers didn't have many tools at all. They had navigation, the navigation instruments that they would have used on ships. So they had a compass and they had an astrolabe, but they couldn't measure longitude. So there was a lot of what we would think of as inaccuracies that way. So when we looked at the maps, when we scanned and computerized the maps, the distance between, say, Montreal and Duluth on Lake Superior varied tremendously. They had more or less the maps in the right, oriented properly, north-south, but east-west varied tremendously, and that's because they weren't sure how to measure longitude. That was figured out in the 18th century. There were a couple of people who kind of came up with methods of doing it simultaneously, but the easiest way of doing it was to have two watches, or chronometers as they called them, and you could keep track of the time with the sun. So you have one watch that, say, is set on the time in Montreal, and you know where Montreal is, and then you keep it at that, and then you have another watch that you set every day you move farther west, and you see the sun straight up in the sky, and you know it's noon, and that changes. So the one watch, it's 1 hour different from the Montreal watch, and then it's 2 hours different, and so you begin to measure how far west you're moving just by the variation in time. It's a really simple way of figuring it out, but it took a long time for the light bulb to go on, and for map makers to figure this out. But once they did, then watches or chronometers became really important tools. And then in the 19th century, map makers were also using sextants, so they could measure where the sun is on the horizon and the curvature of the Earth. And all sailors, sailing vessels have a sextant on board in case your computer system goes out and you can't use your GPS. So those were the technology changed over time, and that allowed for the sort of precision that we see. But for me, that just makes that early map, that 1670s map of Lake Superior, that much more amazing, remarkable, because how is it that they drew that map? And they did it primarily with a compass and measuring distance. So we were going, we're going northwest to southeast at a particular angle for a half a league, and they put that in their map. And then the shoreline turns a little bit, and they put that in their map. So very painstaking drawings in those early periods.
That's fascinating. So detail oriented.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. So this last question. What are some good online sources for these maps? They're so stunning and so fascinating. Is there a way to access them through
the public? Libraries have more and more libraries are putting sources like this online, and so if you haven't, you can find a lot of really good maps in the Library of Congress, I can't even remember off the top of my head the name of the online site, but you can find the maps there very easily. There are a lot of maps in the National Archives in the UK. The Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris has an awful lot of maps digitized, and you can download them, and there's no copyright. There's no there are no restrictions for personal use. You can't publish them in a book without permission, but in many cases, but you can certainly download them and have a look at them on your computer. They're really quite spectacular. There are more and more maps available from the Canadian archives. Most of those maps are copies of the French maps. I would go to the French maps in Paris more directly. There are private libraries in the United States that have maps online. There's actually quite a collection at I think it's the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee has a lot of maps. I think the University of Illinois has a lot of maps online. Places like the John Carter Brown Library in Rhode Island has maps. So if any of you have trouble finding these places, feel free to email me, or if you want, I can put together very quickly a page with some hyperlinks in it that I could send to Alex, and you could contact her if you wanted to find some of these things.
Yeah, I would be happy to share those. Absolutely.
Okay.
Great. Well, Professor Morris, thank you so much for your time and for sharing your expertise with us. We really appreciate it. And thank you everyone so much for joining us. It was a really, really fascinating presentation. Thank you again.
Thank you. Thank you very much. This was fun.
Great. All right, everyone, have a wonderful evening.
Thank you, Alex. You did a great job. Thank you.
Thank you, Susie.